The reason why I chose this topic to present in Korea is for also my research purposes. I want this site or this lecture to serve as a research field in some ways, because I would like to speak with people or hear from people who are living in Korea and in the 1970s and probably have listened to radio in the 1970s in Korea during the Park Chung Hee regime. And in particular, I'm interested in those who might have heard the radio program that I am going to be talking about, Park Chung Hee, in particular a segment called 강진 갈갈이 사건, or the 강진 dismembered body crime, which was very, very popular from what I heard from others who I've spoken to and the newspaper research that I have done. And in some ways, this presentation follows at the heels of Professor Jin's presentation last week on the Korea Wave, going back to the 1970s, and I'm thinking about new media in the 1960s and 70s, which has now become very old media. So the 21st century new media and social media network have opened up more than ample opportunities to document ourselves. The documentary impulse present in today's world through the proliferation of selfies, blogs, Instagrams, Facebook, etc. on the one hand, and the prevalence of historical novels, movies, and television dramas on the other appears to mark an important moment that is begging us to re-examine our past, all the while beseeching us to bear witness to our contemporary politics and society. What is driving this desire to document in South Korea? Additionally, how is a documentary genre or mode working to record, comment, and share this historical moment? The ease with which to record our everyday lives and to share with others has certainly contributed to the proliferation of various modes of documentaries. Undoubtedly, today's mobile and digital technologies play a crucial role in facilitating this process. Yet, perhaps one of the most important driving forces behind the documentary impulse in South Korea may be the election of Park Chung Hee, a daughter of former President Park Chung Hee. It may be no surprise then that the political ascendancy of Park Chung Hee has barely forced the country to harken back to the nearly 2 decades of Park Chung Hee's dictatorial rule to re-examine not only the legacy of this regime, but also the culture of the 1960s and 1970s, which emerged out of rapid industrialization, economic growth, political oppression and censorship, international Cold War politics, and the rise of post-war nationalism. If the internet has become the new media of the early 21st century in redefining mass culture, and the medium through which new narrative forms can emerge, then the radio played the same or similar role in the 1960s and 70s. And I would like to introduce Ch'oe Inhun's linked novel, The Voice of the Governor General, or in Korean, 총독의 소리. The author intentionally connects Park Chung Hee's nationalism and repressive policies to the Japanese colonial period through evoking the form of a radio broadcast. Written in the form of a radio transcript, which strongly harkens back to Emperor Hirohito's infamous radio announcement that marked Japan's unconditional surrender and post-colonial Korea as not having really overcome the colonial, but one that perpetuates the imperialist policies of the past. The purposeful use of radio broadcast in Ch'oe Inhun's novel also points to the ways the state positioned mass media, such as the radio, to discipline the masses into becoming responsible, dutiful, and obedient citizens. By turning it around, however, wherein which Ch'oe Inhun usurps the voice of the Governor General, who distorts the truth of the Korean history through the fictive radio broadcast, the author assists the readers or listeners to critique the technology and the mechanism through which the state disseminates information and conditions thought. As other scholars of Ch'oe Inhun already pointed out, two of the most noticeable forms that Ch'oe Inhun uses in his fiction is his deployment of radio broadcasting, or 방송의 소리, and his parody novels, which rewrites historical tales or novels, And this is done in order to blur or play with fiction and nonfiction. So locating inspiration from Ch'oe Inhun's documentary Impulse, I would like to also explore the interesting documentary term that takes place in the 1970s in radio programming, especially in radio dramas or radio theater. In parallel with his rewriting and or recycling of historical novels, historical dramas such as Park Chung Hee's A Day in the Life of Kubo or Kim Man-jung's Nine Cloud Dreams, historical dramas begin to dominate Korean radio programming. And I think I see this in the contemporary moment as well. The prevalence of historical dramas, television dramas, and of course movies that are being screened. In addition to dramas based on real-life stories, there is a turn back in time to retranslating and rewriting classical tales and biographies for broadcasting. So I would like to ask, what is this impulse for turning back in time, and what kind of effect does it produce, especially in literature? How is literature, both the lead and mass media literary works, continuing to produce a space for the critique of the state-produced truth, capital truth? Through analysis, radio programming, and radio literature, I hope to show that even in the midst of the state's propaganda and censorship, the documentary term plays with creating alternative truth with a small t. So what is documentary and documentary radio? Scholars in the field of documentary film, photography, photography, writing, and radio seem to share a general consensus when it comes to defining what a documentary genre means. They agree that aside from presenting information in a way that appears to be without fictional matters, the more important element of any documentary work, quote, lies in the power not only to inform us, but to move us, unquote. John Byron's collection of essays written by practitioners of documentary radio, their varied in approaches, all tend to make the listener feel something through their documentary work. According to Byron, quote, it's not enough for them to convey facts. They gather words and sounds and music and assemble them painstakingly into an experience, unquote. This ability to capture and convey human experiences also translated into radio becoming one of the most trusted modes of information. In fact, during the golden age of American radio, the 1930s and 40s, it is purported that the radio broadcasting held a greater level of credibility than the press, especially because of the relationship that could be forged between the announcer or the commentator and the listener, in which the methods of persuasion used was, quote, both direct and vicarious, unquote. What Stott emphasizes in this part through his example of the legendary Edward Murrow's radio broadcasting is the paradoxical relationship between the speaker or the announcer and the listener. That is, to know and experience, one must experience it firsthand, but the listener only has the experience of the commentator or the speaker or the announcer. As a result of this limitation and the speaker's acknowledgement of this limits, the listener and the speaker is, as many scholars would say, engaged in something akin to drama. The report of one's voice was a dialogue. The commentary itself had a commentary in the listener's mind. And when the listener believed, it was because he was convinced, or he had convinced himself through his own imaginative trial of facts. So in short, what the scholars of documentary radio and documentary genres say is that there is a very interesting space between the listener and the speaker that has been created, and that through listening, that space is somehow enclosed or comes closer. What would appear to make documentary radio effective then is precisely the gap between the listener and the speaker, and the emotional connection and imagination that allows the space to be bridged. In South Korea, The golden age of radio broadcasting could be dated from the late 1950s to the early 1970s, before television became prominent mass media. Although radio was available and had become an important part of Korea's mediascape starting in the 1930s, colonial Korea, and Michael Robinson has written quite a bit about the radio of colonial Korea. Radio listening peaked in the post-war period, spurred first by domestic production of radio sets in 1959. And this is it's a picture of an image of the first radio set, Gold Star or Kumsong, that was produced in 1959. Media historians in Korea also point to Park Chung Hee's May 16, 1961 coup d'etat as an important juncture in the rise of radio culture in South Korea. They cite the way the Third Republic recognized new media, especially the radio, as an important public relations tool in promoting modernization, and thus actively endorsed the wide dissemination of radio sets, such as the one shown here. In addition, more regional stations and new private broadcasting companies were founded to reach listeners in the rural areas, allowing stations to diversify and expand the number of radio programs. According to a 1962 survey, that asked about from which media outlet does one rely on for his or her news and information, 34.1% of Seoulites responded that they relied on the radio for their information, which was a close second to the newspaper, 39.3%. Interestingly, various surveys and interviews conducted throughout the 1960s and 70s in South Korea show that Koreans were increasingly relying on the radio for their information and expressed, like the American listeners in the 1930s, that they trusted what they had heard on the radio more than the press. Included in Kim Young-hee's study are surveys conducted by the Ministry of Culture and Public Information, which show in 1962, of the 744 people surveyed, 53.4% replied that the radio was more credible, while only 26.3% replied that they believed the press to be more credible. In 1963, in a similar survey, 49.6% of the 1,142 people surveyed replied that the radio was more credible, opposed to only 23% who replied that they found the press more credible. So by the early 1970s, more than half of the South Korean population listened to the radio for one reason or another. The radio and radio listening, similar to Benedict Anderson's claim regarding the press and nationalism, formed an imagined community wherein which members could share not only pertinent information, but more importantly, they forged common shared emotional experiences. Although the radio became an important source of information for Koreans in the 1960s and 70s, it was also a vital source of entertainment. In general, radio programs of major broadcasting stations such as KBS, CBS 기독교 방송, 중앙방송, MBC, DBS, RSB, Radio Seoul included news, music, radio, dramas, weather, culture, education, sports, commentaries, etc. All things that we would expect radio programs radio stations to have. All of which could be further subdivided into more specific programs. For example, radio dramas, which were highly popular amongst listeners, could be divided into serialized dramas, or one-act plays, and even further into various genres such as melodramas, family dramas, and documentary dramas. And this is probably all very familiar to us now as TV watchers. Although music, either Korean or Western, usually took up the largest airtime within the radio entertainment category, radio dramas from the early years of the golden age was where one would find the most loyal listeners who would tune in regularly. And again, thinking about our contemporary television watching experiences, I think it's it parallels. These radio dramas very often created stories either reflecting real life experiences or stories that were out of the ordinary, which in either case enable listeners to forge a connection with the announcer or the characters. As it is the case with contemporary serialized television dramas that Professor Jin talked about, and that now there's a huge fan base, radio dramas also became an intense site of competition among broadcasting companies who tried to vie for listeners and advertisers. In fact, only a fine line existed between what listeners consider information and entertainment, since programs that were classified as entertainment by and large also contained and dealt with new information and human dramas which were based on real-life events, both current and past, which all aimed to provide some insight into the world and the historical moment people lived in. Furthermore, many narrative-driven entertainment programs, in particular dramas, which are usually considered fiction, were far from being empty of fact, but were precisely the site of documentation of everyday life and commemoration of historical events. Hence, what I mean by the documentary impulse or a documentary turn in South Korean radio culture of the 1960s and 70s includes the burgeoning number of fictional radio dramas that dramatize the everyday, creating a documentary effect in the 1960s, as well as those dramas which attended to narrating real-life stories and historical events in a dramatized form in the 1970s. And for the purpose of this presentation, I will focus on the 1970s. So I'm sure many of you already know the historical, political, social context of the 1970s, but just to briefly outline it, as numerous cultural critics have already successfully demonstrated, popular or mass culture is neither void of reality nor politics, and thus the relationship between pleasure or entertainment and politics need to be delineated with care to avoid the degradation of mass culture or to romanticize mass culture as an iconic site of resistance or outside the mainstream. That is, we can take pleasure in mass culture, such as radio dramas, but still be able to politicize the invasive content, state business collusion, and distorted ideologies so that popular culture does not merely become a form of manipulation or populist self-expression. The radio, to be sure, was used as an instrument of the state in South Korea, and especially during the height of Park Chung Hee's Yushin regime. And it is precisely around this time that radio programming also undergoes a major shift toward the documentary. Although the declaration of the October 1972 Yushin Constitution, confirmed by the November 1972 referendum number 21, marks a critical turn point in radio programming and all other media for that matter, the decade preceding the Fourth Republic cannot be ignored, that is the 1960s. As for radio dramas or theater, the 1960s has been characterized as a decade of home dramas, which were differentiated from the 1950s melodramas. If melodramas were to create experiences of a beautiful romantic world, then the home dramas were considered to be a genre that depicted a healthy reality of the world. Centering on the family, these radio dramas feature various conflicts and relationship problems that arose within a family and then usually concluded with a happy ending to ultimately show the restoration of the family, or 가족 회복. In the process of bringing the stories to a healthy and happy ending, these radio home dramas tended to situate the story in the everyday life, and by depicting conflicts as problems stemming from various rapid changes taking place in the society. The conflict between tradition and modernity, for instance, was often at the center of the home drama's plot. It is obvious that the radio home dramas were, even though I'm not going to be mentioning names of some of the dramas and giving you descriptions of these dramas, it is obvious and apparent that radio home dramas were laden with ideological formulations of what was supposed to be healthy family, and by extension, a healthy nation. In essence, I see the 1960s radio dramas as the beginning phase in the documentary term, for these dramas served to document the quotidian as well as to use the everyday life as a way to motivate and shape the society in a certain direction. The heyday of the 1960s radio drama gave way to the second phase of the documentary term, when documentary dramas and historical dramas dominated the airwaves in the aftermath of the Declaration of the Haitian Constitution. There seems to be several reasons for this. According to Ch'oe Inhun, a media critic and scholar located here in Seoul, the increase in television sets and TV broadcasting, which started in the late 1960s, but certainly by the early 1970s, diverted audience from radio listening. And I'm not sure if that's your own experience, whether you shifted from radio listening to television watching in the 70s. Under this kind of circumstance, radio entertainment began to experience a crisis of sort, since television with its new visual representations of reality rapidly increased its appeal to the viewers. Furthermore, a growing number of people found enjoyment in watching their entertainment on the small screen in the convenience of one's home. In particular, radio drama listeners began migrating to watch television dramas. Thus, the vacating in radio listening impacted the radio broadcasting companies in various ways. For many radio broadcasting companies, radio dramas drew in not only listeners, but also advertisers, through which they were able to sustain high production costs of dramas. After all, producing a serialized drama required the company to pay the writer or writers, director, and at times multiple voice actors who were becoming celebrities on their own right. The popularity of television dramas therefore forced radio producers to seek alternative scheduling and programs that could motivate listeners to stay in tune. One way the companies attempted to remedy this dilemma was through new programming. Reading the titles of radio programs published in the newspapers indicated an increase in the number of docudramas and historical dramas, or teha drama, supplanting the home dramas that had become highly popular in the 1960s. The entrance of television undoubtedly posed a stiff competition for radio broadcasting, but another reason for the documentary impulse in radio programming of the 1970s can be attributed to Park's Yushin Constitution and the government's harsh regulation of the content of programming. These regulations range from the minutiae to the outright censorship and suppression of freedom of speech and press. According to new laws regulating broadcasting, home dramas and melodramas airing on the radio needed to abstain from topics such as adultery, love triangles, breakup of families, which was probably the bulk of the 1960s home dramas. Historical dramas also must reject the tendency for them to be the basis of entertainment and cannot contain complaints about the implicitly the state, and it cannot contain overly sorrowful scenes or attitudes of resignation and any elements that distort history. While for shows set in the contemporary times, they must avoid depicting the upper middle class, families, and discourage regional dialects to be spoken, and especially the Cholla province dialect was discouraged strongly to be aired on the radio. Park's undemocratic political moves to indefinitely prolong his presidency and to carry out his authoritarian revitalization goals required not only pliant subjects, but also reorganization of information distribution and reinvention of media content. especially popular mass culture, that obviously had the greatest potential for the farthest reach of the population. What makes Park's Yushin Constitution troublesome to many is its ability to wield changes and amend the existing law according to Park's ambitions. The Park regime could recognize early on that they needed to, quote, take concrete measures to control the direction of mass media and popular culture, unquote, because it was through these modes that people's ideas and emotions could find a wide outlet. For this very important reason, only a few months after the promulgation of the Yushin Constitution in 1973, the broadcasting law underwent radical revision, and the previously organized Korean Broadcasting Company, 한국방송공사, was placed directly under the jurisdiction of the Minister of Culture and Communication, which was essentially governed by the all-encompassing National Council for Unification, or 통일 주체 국민회의. Not only did the National Council for Unification legalize Park's re-election and dictatorship, but under the guise of maintaining national security, they mandated successive amendments to the broadcasting laws, where broadcasting programs had to be submitted for scrutiny under stringent censorship rules. In addition, throughout Park's regime, the Ministry of Culture and Communication controlled the programming policies of television broadcasting, aiming to increase the number of social education programs, children's programs, and general education programs that were supposed to instill national spirit and teach social obedience, while decreasing entertainment programs, especially the daily serialized popular television drama that could be open to more interpretation. Serialized television dramas were forced to change their format to be aired only on the weekends. Ironically, however, the television viewing ratings plummeted since many of the programs were no longer entertaining enough for the viewers. Furthermore, the once popular daily serials, which were relegated to becoming weekend dramas, started to reinvent itself based on its new format and gain renewed interest from the viewers. These dramas tended to be detective stories or melodramas with titillating cliffhangers, which forced viewers to return and tune in the following weekend. So the TV watching viewers was actually increasing. In this milieu, radio programs were also severely affected by broadcasting laws. Combined with the need to compete with visual media, radio programs direly needed to revamp their programming. What we find is a hike in the number of documentaries and a number of different kinds of documentaries, including historical epics, docudrama, live broadcasting, especially interview with notable personalities or everyday citizens, and semi-documentaries, which involve dramatization of historical events or contemporary issues. So dramatization and radio dramas. I would like to now turn to thinking about what is this documentary impulse in radio culture of the Yushin era looked like and sounded like. But of course, my efforts to find some recorded radio programs was very unsuccessful because Munha Bangsong, or MBC, has not archived or kept records of radio programs and radio dramas in particular from the 1970s, and in many cases the scripts do not even exist. I concur with some of the Korean media scholars who made the observation that Yushin era can be labeled as an era of documentary in radio, but I am further interested in exploring not only the historical and political circumstances under which the documentary term emerged, but also how these documentaries worked in spite of the various political restraints and dictates. Cultural historians working on the Park Chung Hee era have already well pointed out Park's strategy and the interest in reinventing tradition and revival and preservation of Korean cultural heritage in order to construct a new nationalist consciousness. Indeed, preponderance of historical films, plays, and novels, therefore, were produced and taken up as a genre to reinforce the Park brand ideology and to construct a cult of personality around Park Chung Hee. The list of historical films, plays, and novels which are set in the mid-Chosun dynasty around the time of Hideyoshi Toyotomi's invasion of the peninsula and Admiral Lee Sun-shin's victory over Japanese invasion in particular is noticeably long enough to call attention to the significant trend. And I think last summer when I was here teaching at Korea University that summer, 3 films about Lee Sun-shin opened in July and August. It appears that radio dramas also follow the trend by frequently airing historical radio plays, either in a serialized form or as an one-act play. In addition to the prevalence of historical epics, radio also turned to docudramas, which usually took significant historical events and presented them through interviews and dramatization. Although these 2 forms might not exactly be the same, I take both of them as documentaries that employ dramatization. For both, the historical epic dramas as well as the docudramas engage in retelling the past. I am interested in the moments of dramatization in radio documentaries as a way to explore the potential for constructing alternative narratives, histories, and truth against the Yushin state's dictates. So in order to think about this and trying to work through this idea of reconstructing alternative narratives, I came upon Gilles Deleuze. He's a French theorist, and his concept of dramatization to think about and read some of these Korean docudramas. And I'm not going to go into at length about Deleuze's concept of dramatization, but to summarize what Deleuze is trying to say, or according to Deleuze, dramatization is not a matter of proceeding from or determined by what came before, but is, quote, explicitly creative rather than reproductive, by no means merely manifestation of a blueprint or a representation of an original. So in other words, what Deleuze seems to be trying to say in developing his concept of dramatization is that dramatization is a dynamic process. So South Korean radio programs, documentary impulse that can be read, or I would like to read it through Deleuze's dramatization. I classify both epic dramas and docudramas as a kind of documentary that employs dramatization. For instance, MBC's epic drama, Imjin River, aired as a special feature to commemorate the 10th anniversary of MBC's founding, as well as other radio dramas that were produced to commemorate various historical events, such as the 20th anniversary of Korea's liberation, and of course, outbreak of Korean War, etc., etc. Drawing from real historical events or figures, but varying the degree of factual information present, epic dramas attempt to document history, but through dramatization, these historical events and figures come to life in a wholly different ways. Whether through direct commentaries that set up the story and bridge the characters' dialogue and actions, or through unique voice acting and special effects, dramatization incarnates the event, as I think Deleuze would put it. And so I have a section on historical dramas, which I'm not going to present here, but there is an interesting analysis I think we can do, especially with Park Chung Hee, the Yushin regime, and Lee Sun-shin. Similarly to the ways epic dramas are produced and can be read, the process of producing docudramas requires dramatization of various kinds in order to create a sense of actuality and meaning. So in this next part, I will discuss one of the most popular radio dramas of the Yushin era, MBC's Park Chung Hee. Has anyone heard of this radio program? in the 1970s. This radio docudrama can figure as an exemplary work that generously inserted dramatization, as well as an example of a radio program that simultaneously turned to the law as its subject. Park Chung Hee is doubly provocative in that it not only attempts to reenact history, but it also endeavors to stand in for or bring about law and order in a society that had essentially become too law-bound or too lawless, meaning that law has become arbitrary at best. The long-running daily docudrama Park Chung Hee began airing on 1st of January 1974, and it ended with its last episode on August 4th, 1980. Each episode was about 20 minutes long and aired in the late evening, sometime between 9 and 10:40 p.m. Its popularity prompted it to be edited and published as a novel in 20 volumes, which still exists and which I am working with. While there are certainly longer-running radio dramas and even longer-running television dramas, Park Chung Hee was one of the most highly listener radio programs in the 1970s, which aired at a time when radio, not having become old media to the new media television, had to compete with television dramas. What seemed to have made this program so popular is the fact that the writer Ch'oe Inhun and his collaborators took up noteworthy, sensational, real-life incidences and investigated them, and then retold them in a just as sensationalized docudrama form. It included interviews and visitations to the sites by the writer for the purpose of dramatization. These dramatizations recreated and retold the incidents, such as the Kanjin Kairai Sakon, which I will talk about, Wooden Mountain serial murders, the fake Igamsok or ghost letters, which were oftentimes events from the past that have been either left unsolved or considered sensational and extraordinary. Just by their titles, you can realize how sensationalized they were. Each of these segments will last for about 2 months, after which a new case will be taken up. In an interview that was published in the Chosun Daily News, Ch'oe Inhun, the writer, states, of course, there is some fiction, but these semi-documentaries are every bit based on real incidents, or 사실. Furthermore, according to Ch'oe, he and his staff have accumulated reams and reams of paper researching and documenting the events for the program, as well as traveling to all corners of the country to locate people and to record the interviews and to see the sites. So the work, such as research, documenting, and interviews that are involved are part of the creating process of the docudrama, and it's supposed to lend weight to the realness or 사실 qualities of these dramas and the search for truth. The purpose of the program, however, is not to solve the cases and offer a new conclusion, but to present the multi-layered perspectives within the case so as to be able to determine between right and wrong pertaining to the crime. What distinguishes this kind of docudrama from news or report is that the narrative is rather elaborate and the situation and the characters are vividly recreated so that as the listeners tune in throughout the 2-month-long episodes, they begin to understand and even empathize with the characters and even the criminals. And so this is an image of that was taken from a newspaper, which showed that on the 500th episode, commemorating the 500th episode of Park Chung Hee, there was a quiz that was sent out to the listeners, and there were, from what I think, with my memory recalls, there were over 68,000 people who wrote in to answer the quiz, which in some ways indicate the number of listeners of this program. And every month, more than 10,000 people were right into the radio, responding to the radio program, and in particular the Park Chung Hee. Park Chung Hee first segment, 강진 갈갈이 사건, or this member body part incident at Gangjin, as I had translated, has probably received the most attention and has remained the most fixed in public memory, not only because of the newness and popularity of the program, but also because of the gruesome, shocking nature of the story that unfolded. More important for me, however, is how this particular segment of the docudrama can serve as an example of the ways documentaries go about producing alternative meanings and truth through dramatization of a supposed historical event. So 강진 갈갈이 사건 is based on a real event that most likely took place in 1939 in the town of Gangjin in southern Ch'oe province. The story in the docudrama is about Ch'oe Inhun, who murders Kal-ji by throwing him off in an embankment, and then in order to cover up his crime, he dismembers the dead man's head, legs, and arms from the body, de-skins the face, pulls out the fingernails and toenails, and then finally scatters them all about the murder site. Ch'eun, the main character in this docudrama, concocts an elaborate scheme to deflect suspicion by pretending that Kal-ji to be still alive and pinning him as the murderer of the unidentified or unidentifiable man. Eventually, of course, Ko is found out. He confesses and then is taken to trial where he receives a death sentence. During his confession, of course, we hear about the endless threats and demands for money he had received from Kal-ji, and Ko entreats that he could no longer go on living under such unbearable conditions. And of course, in the drama, there is lots of sex, adultery, profanity, gambling, and of course, this is all taking place in the southern Ch'oe province, so the characters are speaking in southern dialect. Although Ko does end up receiving the death penalty, the episode spends quite an amount of time appealing to Ko's defense. In 2012, the Gangjin Daily News published a weekly special feature entitled That Time, That Event, from October 2012 to January 2013, which explored the way Gangjin 갈갈이 사건 presented the incident and what kind of effect the radio drama had on the town and the people of Gangjin. This newspaper documentary feature provides numerous insights into the making of 강진 갈갈이 사건, the radio program, in relation to the actual event that the radio docudrama is likely based on. One of the central arguments Gangjin Daily News makes is that the radio drama was too loosely based on the real incident, and it did not tell an accurate or truthful story. First and foremost, the reporter or the writer, Chun, surmises that the radio drama is based on a short 동아일보 article published on May 23, 1940, that reported on an incident that had likely happened on October 30th, 1939 in Gangjin. Chu goes on to write that the most important factual information about the incident, the date, has been erroneously set to March 1946. So Ch'oe's docudrama that was really popular in the 1970s is set in 1946 after the liberation, whereas the real story that the docudrama is based on is actually set in 1939 during the Japanese colonial period. And this is not all. Chu points and bemoans that in the absence of documentary evidence, such as trial transcripts, police records, and so on. Ch'oe, the writer of Gangjin Kalkari Sakon, interviewed only a few people living in Gangjin who barely remember the incident after 30 plus years. Moreover, Ch'oe strongly suggests that Che's docudrama was more fiction than fact and teeming with exaggerations, melodramas, and appalling misinformations, which have all led to Gangjin being stigmatized and incriminated as a place of barbaric, murderous acts, and even now in the contemporary times. It has been said that Gangjin is still associated with this dismembering crime incident as depicted in Gangjin Kaigari Sakon radio drama, and furthermore has negatively affected people living in the town. Ch'oe Inhun is not alone in expressing his disappointment about the role and effect of Gangjin Kaigari Sakon segment from the Park Chung Hee series in altering truth and fact through dramatization and making what is supposed to be a more realistic and more accurate documentary. After all, what Ch'oe Inhun has done is also write a documentary to right the wrong of the previous pen by Ch'oe. But I wonder whether or not accuracy is really the most helpful question to investigate. Radio docudramas like Park Chung Hee is situated in a doubly provocative role. On the one hand, mass media and docudramas could be seen as an instrument of the state that is interested in rewriting history for its own benefits. In fact, it could easily be argued that MBC, or the cultural producers in MBC, acting on behalf of the state, chose to air a documentary that will besmirch the Honam region, the region that has historically been the stronghold for Park's opposition, especially Kim Dae-jun. There is also an interesting attempt to excise the Japanese colonial period from the docudrama that's setting the story in the space of liberation, when partisan activities again intensified in the region, leading to merciless killings in the name of beating out communist sympathizers. The justification for the brutal murder could also point to the harsh and brutal tactics of the state that claims self-defense, protection, and immediate sacrifices in exchange for achieving long-term goals. Yet I also wonder if we could apprise ourselves to such simple one-to-one correspondences and believe that the documentary term was a successful tool only for the state. On the contrary, it appears that the documentary impulse we find in the radio culture of the Ryushin era is rather open to creating alternative meanings, realities, and truth. Dramatization in particular authorized multiple processes and materials. As Deleuze delineated, the process and materials for dramatization is an enactment that is not merely repetitive, but creative. And in this process and site of dramatization, we can locate ideas and practices that go against the state authorized information. For example, from the onset, the time of the crime in Gangjin Kaigari Sakon does not seem to match the incident that it is supposed to be referring to, suggesting that these gruesome murders are not just a one-time event. It could just have, taken place in 1939 or 1946 or even in 1907 while the docudrama was being produced. What resonates for me is, so this is where I go back to Ch'oe Inhun's The Voice of the Governors General, and it's Ch'oe Inhun's thesis in his novel, where South Korea has yet to overcome the legacies of the colonial era. The unresolved nature of the Gangjin murder therefore points directly to the ongoing inability to right the wrongs of history, which the docudramas offer as a critique for contemporary South Korean politics and society. Moreover, Gangjin Kaigari Sakon contains many elements that have been banned from mass media, as I mentioned earlier: gambling, adultery, the use of Southern Chola dialect. The successive media laws attempted to regulate radio programs, yet gambling, adultery, and dialects are what actually figure as the most important aspect to substantiate a sense of reality to the drama. To be sure, there could These could serve as a didactic elements, showing the consequence of such vices. Yet it is precisely through dramatization that these elements could be enunciated, enacted, and enlivened at all in a political milieu that banned them from being disseminated. Thus, the site of dramatization, while applying fiction, also sets up a sense of reality that is not at all reproduction of the original. In other words, the fear which the state infuses could be undermined or reversed through dramatization. Lastly, the serialized format, along with dramatization, allows listeners to form an empathetic connection with the characters, however despicable or untrustworthy they might be. It can also lead to possibilities of alternative understanding and questioning of truth. Unfortunately, because sound recordings of Kanjin Kaigari Sakon do not remain, I cannot speak about the acting and how this had affected the dramatization of this particular docudrama. But from newspaper articles published during the time, this docudrama credits excellent acting as one of the factors for its success. In fact, the actor who played Ch'oe Inhun is Park Chung Hee, the iconic figure who now appears in many of Park Chung Hee's films, who is pictured right here. He is said to have garnered a great following and popularity, especially for his realistic portrayal and his usage of southern Jeolla province dialect in Kanjin Kaigari Sakon. Just as the original story of the 1939 murder in Kanjin spread from mouth to mouth, each time taking on a different and new iteration, the dramatic performance by Kan could be understood as such. So in conclusion, mass media and radio culture occupied an important and large space in the making of the 1970s culture under Yushin regime. Radio indelibly came to be used by the state to maneuver and discipline the masses, but it also became a medium through which cultural producers and the masses found creative outlets to question the state-produced truth. Against the popular belief that documentary texts are based on facts and as a site for reproducing the real, most documentaries can actually be read as dramatization. I believe doing so opens up possibilities for situating documentaries in line with work that produces new creative meaning rather than work that merely reproduces or adheres to the hegemonic beliefs and practices. South Korean radio can easily be described as taking the documentary turn in the 1960s and 70s as a way of responding to the growing repressive regime and technological innovations. These documentaries generously employ dramatizations as a method for reinventing truth and reality. In fact, the docudramas, there are many, and I just introduced one during this presentation, can be read as a site of an intricate drama being played out among the state, the cultural producers, mass media, the listeners, who are all interested in trying to translate and understand what is real and what is true. Thank you.
Professor Jina Kim can entertain a few questions from the floor. Any questions?
As you probably know, in the United States, we had our own counterculture in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and there, one of the big media for carrying the subversive messages was the music, especially on alternative FM radio. Did music play that kind of role in Korea?
I'm not sure. I think so, because there were new groups, folk groups that were emerging, and from what I've heard and read briefly, and I'm not an expert on music from the 1960s and 70s, but I believe that music also played a similar role in creating this alternative counterculture and critiquing of the state. And of course, as a result, these singers, rock singers, music composers, etc., they were often jailed, imprisoned, etc., and censored.
Okay.
There's another one back there. Mr. John?
Oh, okay.
She's hiding over in the corner.
Follow up on Doug's question. How is music incorporated into these docudramas and the radio programs? Because I know on television shows, there's background music that lends to a certain mood or mode or to emphasize a point. I was learning that was incorporated into the radio programs. And also, as he asked about the music that was just the countercultural music, was any of that introduced as like somehow a group was introduced or an orchestra was playing a piece that might have had some effect on the mood set in the docudramas?
So as I said, unfortunately, I was not able to listen to many of the radio programs from the 60s and 70s, and in particular the group of docudramas that I'm working with, Park Chung Hee. It doesn't exist. In fact, the original script doesn't exist. The only thing that has remained is this novelized form of the Park Chung Hee in 20 volumes that Ch'oe Inhun, the writer of the original radio script, has then novelized and published. And that came 10 years after the original radio drama, so it was published in 1983. And in the novelized version, of course, there are no indications to show that insert music here. And that's something that is missing, and unfortunately I cannot speak to that. But I am certain that having read the series of radio dramas that were penned by radio theorists or cultural theorists, Korean cultural theorists from the 1930s, when radio first came to be a very important mass media, to the 1970s, music played an essential role in creating mood and emotion and empathy. So I'm certain that it was also part of these docudramas as well. I just don't know where it happened and what kind of music was being inserted. But we might try to guess, right? Was it, could it have been pansori? I don't know. Or could it have been Western orchestral music? I'm not sure. Or even arirang inserted in there or not. I'm not certain.
Thank you for giving a good description of the interaction of a national or regional audience with the radio docudramas. The question that comes to me now that we are in the 21st century with the most networked, digitalized population on the planet, and of course many people get their entertainment not from the radio so much, but through various forms of iPhones and internet entertainment. Do you see any cultural, behavioral trends that you could draw back to the times of radio, or is just too much time and technology development passed so that there really isn't much connectivity to how people get their news and entertainment today with their parents and grandparents?
Well, that's a complicated question. Not being a communication expert or mass media expert. Let me try to answer that question through my recent experience of radio listening. And last year, I was addicted to an iPod, a podcast called Serial in the States. It was every Thursday morning, I think at 9 or 10 o'clock, a new episode came on. And this was a serialized radio podcast about the murdering of a Korean American high school student girl, supposedly by her Muslim Pakistani American boyfriend. So in some ways, while this is a podcast and supposedly I could listen to it anytime, anywhere with my mobile device, somehow because of the nature of the story and the compellingness of the story, and perhaps this desire to know what had happened next, I was tuning in and sitting in front of my computer listening to this serial podcast every Thursday for 12 weeks. And of course, there were a couple of times when I can listen to it at 9 o'clock, but then I was promptly went back and listened to it. But another difference, I think, with today's technology is that it is, and this is something that I was kind of thinking about. Why has NBC not retained recordings of Park Chung Hee or other radio programming? Is it because it's not important? Is it because it's disposable? And then it then permits me to think about, well, what about today's information? How much are we retaining or archiving our digital contents? And how quickly are our digital contents disappearing? So I think there are interesting parallels that can still be drawn, despite the fact that we live in a different era and we have different technologies that shapes our behaviors somewhat differently.
Okay.
I'm sure, first of all, that if there are any Doctor Who fans in the room, they probably can appreciate what it means that all of these documentaries have been lost. BBC is really terrible at picking up that. What I was really wondering about, and I feel like this must be the information that would still be known, is like how these programs were put together. Like if there were no script, was it a little bit more improvised maybe? Like were they just told, like this happens now, so just go with it, like, oh, like, you're going to be dismembering this guy in the scene or something like that, and talking about it. Or, like, would they be following a script in the studio? Do you know that? And also, secondly, I'm curious how sponsorship worked with that. Like, did they have commercials, or, like, how would that work at that time? If you know that. I'll play that.
Yes. So, the first question about the script. There was a script that was written by Ch'oe and it was, so based on my research on the radio dramas, and in particular this Park Chung Hee, there are scripts, but again, it was destroyed, or it was not archived, or it was not kept. To what extent did the actors follow the script? I'm not sure, but I think from newspaper accounts of the acting that was is lauded as good acting, the voice acting on the part of Peggy Bone. I'm sure that he, as a voice actor, was engaged in a creative process that would allow him to connect with the listeners to an extent that he became a huge celebrity in the radio scene. And the second question about, can you repeat that again? Sponsorship, right, commercials. And I think I mentioned this briefly. Radio, especially radio dramas, depended on advertisers, so commercials, that they had to get commercial sponsorship in order to produce these radio dramas. And they were becoming more and more expensive and costly as they started to get longer, as they had to pay these celebrity voice actors. And in the case of Park Chung Hee, as I said earlier, he stated that he did extensive research that took him to different places. He traveled all across the country. So it was costly. And one of the reasons why these radio dramas, radio docudramas and home dramas were hard to keep up with on the part of the radio producers or broadcasters was because they were constantly having to compete with television for sponsorship, commercial sponsorship.
Thank you. I have three questions from my end.
3 questions?
So, if you can, in reference to the archives, is it as simple as in the 70s? There are so many resources in Korea, and maybe they just didn't have a means of capturing it in the 70s? Could that be a possibility? That why they don't have archives of these radio shows?
I actually don't know whether they had the technology to record them and keep them. Does anyone else know about that?
I don't know about the technology specifically, but during that period, a lot of places, as you said, the BBC didn't archive anything at that time either. So it doesn't seem like archiving programs doesn't seem like it was a practice in many places around the world.
And I was also wondering about the radio medium, right? If newspapers were archived, if prints are now, newspapers are being digitized now and they're available online, is print still being privileged in the 1970s over the voice? I don't know.
Follow-up question. Can you talk about today's radio program compared to what was in the 70s, for instance, that they still have similarities? Because I hear KBS and I hear some of these similar trends that you talked about today, and then also similar in the media side of the house, where docudramas, they talk about particularly incidents happening and presented in whether it's factual or not.
Right. And I have to admit that I haven't listened to contemporary Korean radio dramas, so I don't know. Has anyone else? You seem to have listened to them. Is anyone else listening to contemporary Korean radio dramas? I know they still exist because sometimes when I'm on the bus, I overhear it.
I think there's no radio drama.
There are no radio dramas.
Oh, sure there are.
And taxi drivers love them.
Don't they watch them on TV now?
No, they're on the radio too. There's radio drama. In fact,
Perhaps it's not these long serialized dramas, maybe one-act radio dramas that are also very popular, right?
they're on late at night.
Right. Yeah, I haven't heard, seriously, I haven't listened to contemporary radio dramas to comment on that. So
You have to drive.
I have to drive, yeah.
The production values are quite good.
Is it good? And has anyone listened to the 1970s radio programs in Korea? I'm very curious what it sounded like, what it was about. If you have heard Park Chung Hee, I know that I was talking to Professor Jin, who presented last week. In passing, I asked him, so you grew up in Korea in the 1970s, and he was a high school student, and he said he did not intentionally listen to them, but he would hear it being talked about amongst the people. So apparently it was a big storytelling program.
Sorry, be a bit of a dead horse here, but going back to the Doctor Who BBC comparison, as you might be aware, recently DVDs of the full series came on the market based on tapes from syndication found in Africa a couple of years ago. However, in the previous 2 decades, there had been a concerted effort by the BBC, or obviously the DVDs are making a lot of money for them, to find home recordings of Doctor Who. Now this goes all the way back to the 50s, so I assume the technology existed. Has there been such a call to arms to fans of Park Chung Hee here in Korea?
I think it's a great idea. I'm sure there were some fans who might have had a portable tape recorder or some device that might have recorded Park Chung Hee or other, especially music programs, right? But maybe I should do a call, what is it, call out?
Call to arms.
Call to arms. Hearing, please respond. Anyone who has heard Park Chung Hee. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
If you think Doctor Who is hard to find, try Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which was radio, not television, and notoriously full of anthos. But this goes back to a question I asked last week, and I think it's still relevant. Some of the cultural effect is not the content, but the medium itself. As you get into new forms of media, especially when you're dealing with state control, and a form of medium comes along that's much harder for the state to control, alternative FM radio in the US in the late 1960s, the internet everywhere now, a few other examples, cable TV as opposed to 3 major networks. Everything changes. McLuhan didn't live long enough to find out how right he was. The presence of the medium has a bigger effect on society than the content. That's what the medium is the message meant. Do you see that too in your studies of what happened in Korea?
It's a great question and a complicated one. Well, let me try to answer that by telling you why I am studying radio dramas in the 1970s and 60s when there is no script and recording. I think I am interested in the ways that radio programs have been recorded in other mediums. So such as Park Chung Hee that has been recorded and rewritten in a literary form as a novel. So for me, I think this idea that media can exist in this intermedia form is what interests me in studying this non-existent recording radio drama. And also looking at, I think I showed you an image of the drawings that are also contained in the novelized form of Park Chung Hee. So here in the novelized form, we have the coming together of the visual together with the written, and it's supposed to be was supposed to have been an orally enunciated, articulated form. So what is happening with the orality, the written, and the visual, all in this one production of Park Chung Hee is something that is intriguing me. I'm sure that didn't really answer your question, but that's why I'm interested in it.